Let me know if you can. Okay. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you all to this webinar that we have today. And okay. So we're just setting up, we just completing some last minute technical issues. So thank you for bearing with us. And so this webinar that we have today is organized by the consultative group of experts in its support that it provides to developing countries to prepare their national reports as part of the reporting obligations to the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. As you are all aware, the regional hands-on training workshops that you will be joining aims to respond to related issues highlighted by developing countries and seeks to enhance technical capacity of experts from developing countries to institutionalize data management in their institutional arrangements. So this webinar will be complements and with the in-person workshop that will be held in October. So the objective of this webinar is to introduce participants to good practices in data management, including governance, QA, QC, and stakeholder engagement. There will also be opportunities for discussions among participants to have lessons learned as well. So we have two speakers with us here today, and one is Ms. Tian Wang. She is a CGE member from China, and she will do the first part of this presentation, which is providing an overview of existing MRV arrangements under the Convention and the Enhanced Transparency Framework under the Paris Agreement. She will also provide some regional picture on some of the GHG data issues, and then we'll have some question and answers. The second part will be Ms. Olia Blade. She's from the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute. She will actually be also at the in-person workshop, and she will provide an overview on national GHG inventories, key data type and sources, which will be followed by Q&A. And the last part will be a briefing about the workshop itself and the homework that we would like participants to do. So with this, I would like to hand it over to the presenter, Ms. Tian Wang. So Tian, you have the floor. Just let me know when you would like to change the slides. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Baba, and hope you can hear me clearly. So,
yes, it's perfect. The sound.
Okay. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. And this is from China as a CGE member. And as Baba just introduced, today I will share some first some introduction of the new rulebook, also the comparison between the new rulebook existing MRV arrangement, as well as some GHG profiles from different countries. And as you know, this is a preparatory webinar for our workshop. So I'm also look forward to have some question and answers if there's any after the presentations. So first, give you a introduction of existing MRV arrangements for developing countries. So under the convention, there is obligation for national communications, and also the BUR. The BUR is under the Cancun agreements. So basically, each developing countries, they need to submit national communications every 4 years and BUR every 2 years. And all the BUR reports will undergoing the ICA process, which consists of the first is technical analysis, the second is facilitative sharing of views. Also, there are different layers such as domestic MRV to support all the reporting and review cycle. Also, there's MRV arrangements for the forest activities. And next slide, please. Maybe the previous one.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, so in 2015, under the Paris Agreement, we have set the new Paris Agreements with both the actions, means of implementation, as well as the transparency system. So the objective of the Paris Agreements have set a long-term temperature goal, which is 2 degree, and strive to the 1.5 degree. And Baba, can you one slide, this one. And then we also have the Paris Agreement. We have the goal and part host of adaptation and mitigation, as well as the means of implementation, including finance, technology, and capacity building. And to account for the national actions, there's a transparency system designed, which including transparency of report, including all the reporting and review of the report. Also, there is a global stocktake, which will have all the information as an input every 5 years. And then this mechanism will encourage the parties to either increase their ambitions or increase transparency. And the ambition cycle will go probably every 5 years with the objective in the middle. And each party, they first propose their national determined contributions and to track progress of their NDC, as well as providing the inventory information through the transparency framework. All the information will to the global stocktake. This cycle will, the aim is to help everyone to increase their ambitions over time. Next slide shows the kind of involvement of the current transparency framework to the new transparency framework under the Paris Agreement. We call that the new MPG. Under the current ones, especially for developing countries, the final BUR will be submitted no later than end of 2024. And at the same time, the developed country parties is 2022. And then everyone will involve into the new system. So party will start to submit the first BTR no later than the end of 2024. So if anyone wish to submit an earlier report, they can do that. And the deadline to submit the BTR by the end of 2024. So all the reports submitted will go along to the technical expert review process, followed by the FMCP, which is facilitated multilateral consideration of progress. In the meantime, the current obligation under the convention will still continue, meaning that developed countries will still submit annual GHG inventories, and everyone will continue to submit national communications. And in the new MPG, guidelines ask parties to submit joint report, which means you can submit the national communications with your BTR together to avoid the undue burden for the parties and the review experts. In the new MPG, it's on another important part is there's a built-in flexibility to those developing country parties who needed in the light of their capacities. Developing country parties, they have some flexibility for less frequent or less reporting requirements, which I will show you in the next slides. And so under this slide shows a comparison between the enhanced transparency framework, which we call that ETF, a comparison between ETF and the existing MRV arrangements. So you can see that in the screen, the reporting side, the Article 13 asks each parties to submit national greenhouse GHG inventories as well as the tracking progress of NDC. Also, for developing country parties, this needs to report the FTC support needed and received. And all this information were asked by the And for climate change impacts and adaptation is not a mandatory requirements. And on the review side, actually the new TER and FMCP are very similar as the ICA process. So the first process is a technical review process. Before it's called technical analysis, now it's called technical review. But the aim of this process is to check the consistency of the reports with the guidelines. And then it will go into the multilateral process, which the party have the opportunities to present their BUR, present their especially their NDC progress in the SB meeting or in the COP meeting. And all the other parties have the chance to ask questions. This parties space to exchange their experiences and good practices. And next slide, please. And this slide shows a detailed comparison with the current MRV arrangement with the new guidelines in the future. So for the new guidelines, for the GHG inventories, it is mandatory to use the 2006 IPCC guidelines, comparing with 1996 in the current guidelines. And the latest inventory year is no more than 2 years prior to the submissions, but the developing countries have the flexibility to submit GHG inventory years no more than 3 years. So comparing with X-4 in current guidelines, in the future, in the new guidelines, is X-3 for developing countries. And for time series, the new guidelines also ask for consistent annual time series with the starting year start from 2020 onwards for developing countries. But at the same time, you have to submit the NDC reference year to show the consistent GHG inventory to track your NDC progress. Also for the gases, it's 7 gases, but 4 of them will provide flexibility to developing countries. The new part of the guideline is tracking progress of implementation and achievement of NDC. NDC is a new kind of contributions under the Paris Agreement, but it's very similar to, somehow similar to the NAMAs, which is now tracked in the BUR. So basically this part, the national target or national proposed by the parties. And in the BTR, you need to select your national determined indicators and to track progress every 2 years. Next slide, please. And also in the ETF, it includes the climate change impacts and adaptation. And this part is not the requirements for BUR, but it is required in the NC national communications. It includes the adaptation impacts, adaptation, as well as information on loss and damage. Also, in the BTR, you need to report the support needed and received. And this part is a lot more detailed comparing with the current, as you see, is more clarity and over 20 parameters provisions is much more information needed. However, it's a should requirement, so it's not a mandatory for developing countries, but it's strongly encouraged that for developing countries to provide this kind of information. And also the information support needed and received will not subject to the technical expert review. And next slide. And after explaining on the reporting requirements, now we are going to the review process. The review composed of actually there's two processes. The first one is technical expert review. And for developing countries, information to be reviewed is national inventories, tracking progress. And support provided only is only for developed countries. So instead of the whole BTR, there are only two parts will undergo the TER. And according to the guidelines, the first BTR will undergo an in-country or centralized review. So for developing countries, you have the flexibility to choose undergo a centralized review of your first BTR. Also, the concept of simplified review is introduced for those countries who submit inventories in the undergo a simplified review. After the TER is finished, the party will undergo a facilitative multilateral consideration of views. It's a multilateral process, and according to guidelines, efforts under Article 9, which is the support part, and the implementation and achievement of NDC will undergo the FMCP. So it's a consecutive process. So first the report will undergo a TER process, and after TER is completed within several months, the FMCP will start and will go with the multilateral negotiation meetings. So either in the one session during June or at the COP session at the end of the year. Next slide, please. So that finished the first part of the comparison of the new requirements and some highlights. And now we are showing the different regional profiles of country submissions. This graph shows the regional perspective of NCBUR submissions. You can see that in the Africa and Asia Pacific regions, so most countries have NC1 and NC2. Some of them already goes to the NC third and fourth NetComs. And in Latin America regions, more countries submit the third and fourth NC. And also many countries have already submitted the first BUR. They submit the second. And here you can see it's different according to the regional circumstances. Slide, please. And this graph shows the submission of BUR and the ICA participations. Again, there's large differences across different regions on how many countries have participated the ICA process. as you can see that many countries have already completed the first technical analysis and also the FSV, and some countries have started the second round, and a few countries completed the full 2 cycles of TA and FSV. Next slide, please. And also this graph gives you a impression of the inventory year that the developing countries are submitting. So according to the guidelines, BUR guidelines, the country's inventory years should not be later than X-4. So most countries have submitted the inventory year in 2000 and 2010, as well as 2014. And some of the countries have capacities to submit a continued time series. And most countries have submitted like single year inventories. And for some countries who already submitted the third, they have covered the newest year of 2016. Next slide, please. And as for the sectors of GHG inventories, among the total 62 countries, all of the countries submitted the inventory, including the energy sectors, and most of them submitted including the industry process and the waste sectors. And some of the countries have submitted land use LULUCF culture. And a few countries, only 5 of them, has covered the solvent and other product use. And many countries actually include this part in the industrial process. Next slide, please. Because our workshop covers Asia Pacific and Eastern Europe, so here we a comparison of different countries, the GHG profiles of different countries. 4 examples, including Korea, Vietnam, Moldova, and Tuvalu. And as you can see that for all of the 4 countries, the energy sector contributes the largest emissions in their GHG profiles. Other than that is different by countries of the emissions from other sectors. For example, for Vietnam, the second largest is industry process, but for Tuvalu, the only second largest is from the waste sectors. So it's very different that how the GHG emissions, how they were contributed according to different developing countries' national circumstances. Next slide, please. Also, other than the workshop, which is going to be held in October, the Secretariat also organized other capacity building events in the Pacific and Eastern European regions this year. For example, in September in Maldives, there's a workshop on building of sustainable national GHG inventory management of systems. And also there are 3 quality assurance workshops this year in January, March, and May. And all the informations will be listed on the UNFCCC website. In conclusion, according to the Paris Agreement, the transparency framework is a very important pillar to implement the agreement. It will help the parties to build trust and to show how the implementation of their NDC going on. And although the new requirements have some more requirements for different countries, there's a flexibility requirements built in. And as you can see from the previous slides, the system has not dramatic change, but many of the existing MRV arrangements provides perfect opportunities for developing countries to make improvements and to continue to increase their transparency. And also there's 5 years from now to encourage parties to continue preparing BUR and participating in the ICA process, which will help them to move into the new transparency framework in the next few years. Also, from our previous experiences, the institutional arrangements is a key for a robust domestic MRV system to fulfill the ETF requirements. And there are many good practices and successful stories to be learned from among the developing countries. And lastly, it's very important for the developing countries have the ownership to build their domestic MRV systems, and especially to complement their current ones and to make improvements. Also, there is not only for the UNFCCC obligations, but it's very helpful and important to track the domestic climate actions. And all of this will be an essential to successful implementation of ETF. That's all from my presentations, and I'm looking forward to any questions from the floor. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Tian, for a very concise presentation. As of right now, we haven't received any questions yet from the participants. So what we will do is, I think we will move on to Olia, and then we will see if participants have questions at the end of Olia's presentation. All right, so let me hand it over to Olia now, and then, okay, Olia, you have the floor. Please go ahead.
National greenhouse gas inventory, key data types. So without further ado, let's begin. Effective mitigation of climate change requires a clear understanding of greenhouse gas emissions and their sources, and regular monitoring and mitigation strategies and their impacts. The practice of MRV, which integrates three independent but related processes of measurement or monitoring for M, reporting for R, and verification for V, is fundamental in this regard. The first MRV process is measurement and monitoring. Why so? This is simply because you can't change what you can't measure. That is true whether you're talking about losing weight, improving your race time, or reducing greenhouse gas emissions. When it comes to climate action, effective measurement verification of emissions and emission reductions is critical to help countries understand sources and trends of GHGs, design mitigation strategies and adaptation guidance, enhance credibility, and take other policy actions. These may include physical measurement of GHG emissions, estimating emissions or emissions reductions, calculating changes relevant to sustainable development, and collecting information about support for climate change mitigation. Unfortunately, measurement and monitoring aim to provide a reliable base and solid factual background for transparency reporting and guide decision-making. But not always people understand what exactly is meant by the process. Thus, we need to discuss it further. Next slide, please. The purpose of the second process within MRV, reporting, is to make the information accessible to a range of stakeholders and citizens, wider public, and facilitate informed choices and decision-making. Examples may include compiling inventories, projections, creating other reports in standardized formats, and evaluation of effectiveness measurements and measures and policy interventions. Next slide, please. Verification process aims to ensure that the data and information that you got during measurement and monitoring process are credible, reliable, and robust. It usually includes independent assessments and evaluations that create accountability, provides feedback, and ultimately facilitates improvement. Some examples of verification are independent reports based on parallel sets of data. Verify calculations by using different models and methods, and parallel and independent evaluations. You can think, for example, of using top-down and bottom-up or reference approach in energy sector to calculate energy emissions, comparing the results obtained from applying Tier 1 and Tier 2 methods to calculate emissions from the same category, or comparing country-specific emission factors to IPCC default range. Next slide, please. As you can see in this slide, the MRV covers a wide spectrum of actions and certainly includes manipulations with large volume of information and big data sets. That is why, to ensure the quality and efficiency of MRV work, it's a good idea to apply systemic thinking and use reliable and robust information systems. These do not necessarily require expensive arrays of cray computers. In fact, first and outmost, they require a clear understanding of data requirements, organization of information flows, and the processes that are involved in information processing. Then, some or all of this could be formalized and computerized, of course, depending on the need of each particular country. Looking at the MRV landscape from this angle, we can identify three basic components that underpin key data types and information flows. As you can see in the slide, GHG-associated data and processes are only part of this landscape and thus represent just one component of a climate MRV information management system. First, greenhouse gas data is just one component of the climate MRV management system. Therefore, we can move on into this part deeper. Next slide, please. As Tian mentioned earlier, MRV process can occur at different levels, which means data collection should reflect this structure. MRV data can also be managed and reported at the facility level. Such data could support developing environmental and economic indicators, establishing performance and sustainability benchmarks, and incentivizing project-level actions. Next slide, please. Signing the Paris Agreement, the approach to MRV has changed. First of all, it became wider and more unified. The world has become one climate family where everyone contributes to the good of all. This drastically changed the breadth of actions and activities and consolidated efforts in dealing with the effects of climate change. In turn, it gave a strong push towards strengthening institutional and management systems to confront effects of climate change and support mitigation and prioritizing resources and tools that could be of help to do so. Consequently, it provides a wider knowledge and knowledgeable, skillful people to be involved in the climate change action, and thus intensify the need in setting up and further development of the relevant education systems. Now, we will make the next step in understanding the core part of climate data management systems that help us to be fast and efficient in our MRV work. Next slide, please. As you all know, to get the best tool for the job, first you have to figure out exactly what you need, how you use it, and if you can afford it. Translating this simple wisdom into a project language, here's what we need to do. First, we need to establish specific data output objectives. Second, we need broadly define the shopping list, that is, the scope of the system, or what it will cover and what it will not. Next, we will make a more detailed list of technical requirements for the system's functionality that tells what exactly it is you need the system to do. Then, we combine the requirements with the institutional arrangements to make sure that what the system to do is agreed with all relevant people and agencies that would be involved in systems work one way or the other. It knows their rules and responsibilities in relation to the system, which is a very important part. Finally, we will confirm staffing and funding for the development and operation, so you are not money halfway through. As we already have a pretty good idea what our data objectives are, as these are more or less defined through the Katowice rulebook and will be, no doubt, further refined. The next step is to define system scope and its basic requirements. Next slide, please. There are lots of things that data management system can do. During the coming workshop, we will discuss this in greater detail. The list in this slide shows some examples to give you a good start, like documentation of supporting data collection and quality information, or calculating emissions, etc. I encourage you to look at the slide again after the webinar and think which of the given scope areas would be most important to your particular country and which would be less important or even redundant, which is quite possible. Perhaps you could make additions to this list. Next slide, please. A couple of examples of MRV systems at work. It could be as complex one in the left-hand side, the first example, which presents just a small portion of the inventory institutional arrangements for the energy sector. The second example on the right shows a more generalized framework for the system in Tanzania. You probably noticed that both diagrams could be further improved, and that goes far beyond the graphics. For example, in the US EPA diagram on the left, it is not clear who submits the data on mobile combustion to 5 different agencies in the picture in the first place, or which company or agency collects the data about coal mining. In the example from Tanzania, on the right-hand side, it is not clear whether the sector experts decide at the various government agencies, for example, Ministry of Energy, and what their role is. For example, do they do data collection from the external providers, preliminary data processing? Do they calculate emissions from each sector? All of the above. When you are drawing such diagrams for your countries, I encourage you to ask yourselves these questions. Make sure that the institutional arrangements tells you a story about people and think how could you make it as simple and informative as possible. Next slide, please. There are several layers of data that are relevant to GHG reporting. I just introduced you to the first layer, which describes institutional institutional arrangements for GHG reporting. The arrangements enable and govern data collection, processing, and sharing information with others. Now, we will move towards the next layer, which presents the fundamental part of GHG reporting, the activity data. Now, why is data collection an important part of the GHG inventory compilation? Well, first of all, data collection is an integral part of developing and updating of GHG inventory, which underpin many mitigation processes, actions, and reports, and enable forecasting actions in the future, as well as inform policy and decision-making for different components of MRE. Secondly, it is an IPCC good practice to establish formalized data collection activities that should be adapted to national circumstances and viewed periodically. Finally, last but not the least, the data collection produces procedures are necessary for finding and processing existing data, as well as for generating new data by surveys or measurement campaigns. Please note that data collection should have values and uncertainties, because we need to be aware how trustworthy our data are. Next slide, please. So, what are the key data types needed to estimate greenhouse gas emissions? Considering that the most basic method to estimate emissions is a simple product of activity data by emission factor, the key data type associated with estimating emissions would include activity data, emission factors, and of course, emissions themselves. An inventory is characterized by those parameters that you all need to be aware of, involved in your system, is of course the chemical and physical identity of greenhouse gas emitted or sequestered. Direct greenhouse gases that are reported in the inventories include carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons known as FCs, perfluorocarbons referred as FCs, sulfur hexafluoride, and nitrogen trifluoride. There are also physical characteristics of greenhouse gases known as global warming potential, GWPs, which allow us to calculate total emissions of different gases of different nature. The next parameter that we have to be aware of is the sector and activities or sources that cause emissions and removals. IPCC guidelines give guidance for emissions from each sector. The third parameter is the location of emissions and removals, meaning geography. It is a mandatory requirement that the inventories include a complete geographical coverage for each country. And parameter number 4 is the time period over which emissions and removals are estimated. For the inventories, this time period equals to 1 year. Each of these 4 parameters also has supporting documentation, meaning metadata. For example, metadata could include the year data were collected, method for data collection, calculated certainty of data set, assumptions made in collecting data, classification methods, etc. How do you know what data to collect? For each source of emissions and removals, the IPCC guidelines have a section describing emission factors and choice of activity data. So I encourage you to look at those sections of IPCC guidelines when you're thinking about inventories and systems. Next slide, please. I'll focus. For now, I will focus mainly on data collection within this presentation. But please remember that inventory development is an iterative process, so different parts of the inventory can be revisited during the inventory year. All of the inventory activities highlighted in yellow in this slide are data management steps. This includes screening available data sources, identification data gaps, collecting available data, collecting data for each key category, identification of data inputs, and evaluation of data inputs. Few of these steps include management issues, of course. For example, planning, institutional arrangements and government, capacity, quality, storing, archiving, stakeholder engagement, communications, and reporting. Next slide, please. The first three steps are important precursors to data collection. Those are starting the inventory. Of course, an inventory accounting of anthropogenic human activities that result in emissions of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. An emission inventory is a database that lists by source the amount of air pollutant discharged into the atmosphere of jurisdiction with a given time period. So the inventory includes all GHG emissions and removals that take place within a specific boundary. We will focus on national inventories right now. But as mentioned earlier, there are other options like subnational, organizational, project inventories, etc. The principles of the inventory include transparency, accuracy, consistency, comparability, and completeness. All these principles are included in IPCC guidelines that describe the details. Next, what you need to do before you collect the data is to identify key categories. Why so? Because the key categories will show you which are the biggest sources of emissions in your country. Where do you have to focus your main effort in collecting the data? The carbon dioxide usually comes in biggest amounts from transport and using of fossil fuels like coal, crude oil, etc. Methane usually comes from natural gas systems, landfills, and agriculture. The biggest sources of nitrous oxide usually include manufacturing, agriculture, and cars. Sulfur hexafluoride is emitted in largest amounts from electrical transmissions and magnesium production. As for PFCs, the biggest source usually is aluminum production, and HFCs are mostly produced from semiconductor manufacturing as well as refrigerating, air conditioning, mobile and stationary. There are also indirect greenhouse gases, but their reporting is not mandatory. There is a concept called KCA, Key Category Analysis. This analysis allows you to show which categories are the biggest emitters and also show which categories are growing or diminishing the fastest as the year coming. Well, the next part is selecting the methods. Methodological choice means that you need to know which types of data would be required for this particular method or the other method. There are three methodological tiers in IPCC guidelines, which I refer you to, and each of them require collection of certain data types and information at a particular of details appropriate for the particular tier of the method. Next slide, please. Now we move to data collection basics. Collecting the data is most critical, of course, and often the most resource-demanding aspect. Where can we get the data and who can be the data supplier? It's a big question and it doesn't always have an easy answer. However, here are a few tips. Activity data are typically collected through statistical agencies, departments, and census. They can be collected from academia, like universities, or industry associations or individual companies and firms. They can be also obtained from laboratories or specialized organizations. For emission factors, we can use, of course, IPCC guidelines with default emission factor values. For country-specific values, we probably should be using research studies and expert judgment. We can also use international organizations and even countries. Also, there is emission factor database, which is maintained by IPCC, that can be used to obtain emission factors for tricky categories. Next slide, please. Now we're moving to institutional arrangements. Those are described who, what, and when are involved in inventory production. These arrangements include the legal, institutional, procedural elements that needed to estimate, report, and archive greenhouse gas emissions and sinks. This involves the description of the procedure, the collection and documentation of data executed by different teams and agencies. Next slide, please. Here are the key principles to focus on when planning for data collection. Focus on the key categories first. As I mentioned before, it's because they show us where the largest emissions are coming from, which categories are having the greatest potential to change, where the highest uncertainties reside, and which mitigation measures planned or implemented. Other focal points choose procedures that continuously improve the quality of the inventory. Also need to collect the data at the level of detail appropriate to the method used. Remember what I was talking about tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 methods? Also need to review the data collection activities and methodological needs on a regular basis so that we are up to date and we are most efficient in data collection exercises. In general, national data are better than international, and peer-reviewed data are better than non-peer-reviewed, etc. So direct data are better than surrogate, and public data are normally handier than confidential. Next slide, please. It is a good practice to engage data suppliers in the process of inventory compilation and improvement from the beginning. That way, you will have them as allies on your side. And they will also better understand your data needs. It is also a good idea to establish a formal memorandum of understanding or other mechanisms to collect data in a time frame appropriate for the inventory on a basis. It will make your life much easier. It is also advised to communicate clearly your requirements and involve your data providers in the QA and QC process. Finally, don't forget to acknowledge them in the final report. Many of them, their names published, is a very big incentive to provide in time. Make them your family, your peers, rather than a stranger who provides you some numbers. Next slide, please. Of course, there are barriers to data sharing. It's not a secret. And those barriers could include technology, the expenses to collect the data, or the expenses spent on collecting and maintenance the data. Data is powerful. Often it's not freely shared due to concerns of misuse or confidentiality. Remember that effective data sharing includes metadata and describes how the data is organized, what its limitations are, and how to use it. Next slide, please. Finally, I would want to stop on a few suggestions on what we can do to overcome data sharing issues. On the organizational side, set up and advance relevant contracts and MOUs and procedures and reach an agreement with your data suppliers, especially agreement concerning sensitive data, procedures for maintenance and data integrity, procedures for ensuring data quality, and strategies to ensure data security. You also need to set up routines for regular collection or informal updates of the data. On the implementation side, engage data suppliers in activities and do it at the earliest possible stage. For example, offer an initial estimate from the category so they will know a ballpark evaluation of what they're supposed to provide. Explain your providers the intended use of the data so they are relaxed about it and they are confident that the data will not be misused. Cooperate to derive mutually acceptable data sets. Point out potentially high uncertainties so your providers are aware about it and make effort to reduce those uncertainties in the future. Collaborate in improving estimates. Make sure the providers are your collaborators, your co-workers in this stage, as I mentioned before. It is a good idea to assign statistical workshops that would explain to a greater detail to the data providers the meaning of the data, how to identify the quality of the data and the best ways and best approaches to data collection. Also, as I mentioned, the credits and acknowledgements to the data provider and make sure they know you are going. Well, that is all from me for now. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Olya, for your very thorough presentation. As of now, we have not received any questions from the participants, so I would like to urge you to please send in your questions by the chat now. But if you have questions that may come up later, then we can also answer those questions at the in-person workshop. But if you have them now, something that has maybe struck you as you were listening to the presenters, then please just send it to us on the chat. Just so you know, we will share, we have already shared these slides with you as part of when you were asked to sign up for the webinar. But we will anyway, again, share this as part of the entire workshop package to you as well. So I will just take like 2 minutes for the participants to maybe think about any, or a minute to think about any questions that you may have. Okay, since we haven't received any questions, what I will do is I will hand it over back to Olya to explain the homework to you. And also we'll talk about the next steps for this workshop.
Right. As you know, we have the homework for this workshop. So the homework should be emailed to us separately following the webinar. And the due date is 2 weeks before the workshop, so we could have a look at the results and make some useful conclusions that we will present to you at the workshop. Homework, please select a category which you know the best or where you have the most available information. Map the categories data activities, document data sets within the map, and rank the data management challenges that you can meet or you were meeting before during this. Right, so if you have any further questions about homework, please ask now.
All right. It seems there's no additional questions on the homework either. So this brings us to the end. Okay. We received one comment. And this is about a template and how this exercise would look like. So yes, we will share the homework exercise template as an example for you to do this. Let me just give it to Olya to maybe explain a little bit further. So Olya will, so we will share some documents that we have for some examples so that it's that you are aware on how to do this exercise. Please feel free to ask us any questions, should you have any. So as you are aware, this workshop will be from 7 to 9 October in Siem Reap, Cambodia. Next week, we will share with you the draft agenda and details of the program for this workshop. Please register and let us know if you need any further support from us. Tian, I'd like to give the floor to you. Would you like to say any last concluding remark?
Okay, thank you, Bala. So I still want to thank all the participants attending this webinar. And, I believe that many of you have more questions regarding the new NPT as well as the GHG institutional arrangements. And I hope that we will have successful exchange during the workshop, and myself will also be there. So I'm looking forward to meet you all in Cambodia. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Tian. Let me just all right, just to Olya for any concluding remarks. Hi, Olya. I think we might have lost Olya's connection. She's all the way in New Zealand. So thank you very much for taking the time to join this webinar. We will share a recording as well as the homework and presentation. Okay, we have Olya again. Please go ahead. Okay, I think we're having some connection issues with Olya. So I will wrap up, and we look forward to seeing you in Cambodia. And please email us at tisu@UNFCCC if you have any questions. Thank you very much.